Welcome back to the GCSE Maths Pro YouTube channel. Today's video is the final part of the proportion topic, a really quick video on proportion graphs. You should have seen the first 3 videos already. The first 2 will, I guess, slightly help with this video, but it's not really necessary to have watched those already. You can kind of watch this straight away. So let's get straight into it. I've seen some questions where they basically give you sometimes 4 graphs drawn, sometimes even 9 graphs, and it says match it up to the correct proportion relationship. And you've got a little table with the proportion relationships, and you have to put the letters, right? Hopefully some of you have come across that before. So we're just going to go through and explain the proportion graphs. Obviously, in our first 2 videos, we used the letters Y and X. They can be any letters, but in this case, it relates literally to a graph, doesn't it? This is the Y-axis, this is the X. So in this case, we were saying it's a formula, it's an equation, but think of it as a graph equation, right? Y equals K, which remember we said is constant, is a number times by X. So it could be anything really, but let's just say it's Y equals 2X or anything like that. What type of graph is that? If we just look at that and forget about proportion, if we just look at that equation, what type of graph is it? For GCSE, you need to be able to recognize straight line graphs, quadratic graphs, cubic graphs, so x cubed, reciprocal, and exponential graphs. Okay, so there's only like 5 or so that you need to recognize. So obviously going to have to be one of those, isn't it? This one, hopefully you'll recognize it as a linear graph. Okay, it's just x. It's not x to the power of 2. It's not quadratic, as it's not a cubic graph. It's not divided by anything. It's just y and x. Linear graphs are straight line graphs, aren't they? Straight line graphs are normally in the format of y equals mx plus c. Now, technically in this case, the plus c is just 0, which is fine. You can have that. It might not have a plus c technically. And the k is therefore the gradient of the line, isn't it? Anyway, so the point is, if it says y is directly proportional to x, and you remember that obviously the formula for that is y equals kx, just think, well, what kind of graph is that actually? It's a straight line graph, isn't it? So just look for the straight line. Obviously, when we've also said directly proportional, that was the fact that they're both, in this case, x and y, going in the same direction, aren't they? So you can see here, as x increases, y also increases, doesn't it? So you might have, it might give you a straight line graph, but it might be going like that. That's really not straight at all, is it? But let's pretend that I've just drawn a straight line. They might do it downwards, effectively, is what I'm trying to say. That wouldn't be direct proportion. Okay, yeah, it's a straight line graph. However, if you think about it, x is increasing, but y is decreasing. They're going in opposite directions. Okay, so it's a straight line graph, and it's going upwards like this. Okay, the next one is a bit harder, and that's why I want you to have seen it rather than be in the exam and trying to guess. Y is inversely proportional to x. Now we know, you should already have this memorized, that the formula for that is y equals k over x. Again, k is just a number, so let's pretend that it was 2 over x. Sometimes we think, oh, well, it's inverse, so it's probably just the opposite of the other one, it's going down. Well, no, because this formula is not a linear formula. This is actually a reciprocal graph. Well, the formula is a reciprocal formula. Basically, reciprocal is y equals any number over x. X is in the denominator. And a reciprocal graph is just like this, just 2 little curves. Okay? Now, yes, reciprocal graphs are something that you should recognize anyway. You might just not have known that they relate to inverse proportion in this way. Okay, so it is on your syllabus to recognize the formula for a reciprocal graph and how to draw it. The other thing to mention is that obviously they're in this quadrant up here. Okay, so the top right and the bottom left. Because some reciprocal graphs are this way around. Okay, so it just depends how hard they are on the question, really. Hopefully it's just one that looks like this and you'll know it's the reciprocal graph. Okay, so we're just trying to connect the dots here. Different parts of the syllabus that you might not have thought overlap, they actually do. Okay, so that's a reciprocal graph for inverse proportion. And the last 2, I have seen them ask when you've got x squared as well. Sometimes with the proportion ones, they give you 4 graphs, and they kind of expect you to recognize 3 of them, and then the 4th one is just like a process of elimination, right? So I know you're probably looking at this bottom graph going, surely that's not in our syllabus. I guess not, but the other 3 are, right? So if you've got 4 options and you can figure out the other 3, you must get the final one correct as well, right? So don't panic about that. Okay, y is directly proportional to x squared. Well, remember when we looked at that question, if you've got an x squared or an x cubed or whatever, it's still k times by that, isn't it? Again, k is just a number. Let's pretend it was 2. Y equals 2x squared. Well, that is no longer a straight line graph, no longer linear, is it? It's got a squared. That is now a quadratic graph. And you should know that quadratic graphs, when they're positive, is a U shape, isn't it? So that's positive x squared. Technically, if it's negative, it's upside down U shape, isn't it? But most of the time in this type of question with proportion, they're probably going to mention positive x squared. So you're looking for some form of a U shape like this. Again, it goes through 0, 0 because there's no plus c. The plus c is 0, isn't it? Okay, so that one you should also be able to recognize and link the 2 together. I know quadratics look like a U shape, and if there's an x squared as the highest power, then it's probably a quadratic equation, isn't it? And as I just said, the last one will probably just be process of elimination. You'll just write down whatever letter is missing. But just so you can see it, y is inversely proportional to x squared. Quite an unlikely case, but just in case. Obviously, we would fill out the formula as y equals k over x squared in this case. You don't really need to recognise this graph as such. As I said, it's the first 3. If you're really stuck, you could make a little xy table. It just depends on, how much time you have in the exam, if if it's worth the mark or not. You could test out a few numbers and so on, but it's mostly going to be process of elimination for this final one. But just so you've seen it is this kind of odd shape. I'll go back quickly. Similar to this, we've just kind of reflected that one up here, haven't we? But you could test it out, just make up a value for k, as we've said, let them 2 or 1 or whatever you want, and then chuck in some coordinates and see what happens to the shape if you're really stuck. But yeah, the main 3 is the quadratic, this normal reciprocal graph, and then a straight line graph or a linear graph. So that's really it for proportion graphs. It's not really a topic in itself, it's just something to touch on because I have seen questions about this, matching up the graph with not the equation even, but just they say this, sentence, and you have to match it up. Okay, so just be really familiar with the formulas, which you'll need anyway for proportion questions, but just then try and think a little bit further and actually kind of interpret, okay, yeah, y equals kx, don't just look at it as face value, like try and think, well, what other areas of maths have I seen that before, or something similar to that before? It's a straight line, isn't it? This one is reciprocal. And as I said, the other one is quadratic. So just so that you're aware, a lot of the time, different parts of the syllabus do actually overlap in areas that you might not realise initially until you start doing past papers, but that's all you need to know. So hopefully you'll have seen all the other videos as well. That should be everything you need to know about proportion. If you're really happy and confident with algebra, and obviously graphs are including with algebra, most of this should be fine anyway. It's really just algebra, isn't it, ultimately? But thanks for watching this video. Check out any of the other videos if you want to go back. They'll be linked down below, and make sure to subscribe.